Antikythera mechanism. You hold a crusty bronze fragment, and the tiny gear teeth catch the light. At first it looks like junk pulled from the sea. Then you notice the precision, and you realize someone cut those teeth on purpose. Someone built a set of interlocking gears 2,000 years ago to model the sky. The device came up from a shipwreck in the early 20th century. Divers brought home twisted bronze plates and fragments that no one could place at first. Scientists X-rayed the fragments and found a crowded tangle of gears, a clockwork of the heavens hiding under corrosion. It could track the moon, the sun eclipses, and even the timing of games and festivals. That level of mechanical invention should not belong to its age. That is why it felt impossible. Here is what is really happening. The mechanism uses gear ratios and a clever pin and slot that imitates the moon's uneven motion. It encodes cycles people use to plan calendars and predict eclipses. The inscriptions explain parts of its functions, but they were scraped by time. For centuries, no one imagined ancient engineers could machine bronze so precisely. The result was disbelief and silence. So, how did it vanish from view for so long? Ships sink. Wars burn libraries. The knowledge of metal working can be local and fragile. After the fall of Hellenistic centers, the technique faded, and the fragments sat forgotten on the sea floor until an accident of recovery exposed them. Scholars early on misread the pieces as decorative. That delay let myths grow and let claims of suppression take root. But the deeper mystery lingers. Why do so few ancient texts describe devices like this when echoes of complex machines appear in scattered writings? Some knowledge was lost to decay. Some may have been guarded in workshops and not written down. The machine forces us to ask how much we assume about progress and about the gaps we call erasure. The mechanism also carries text. Tiny Greek words survive on the bronze. They explain what some dials mean. They name eclipse cycles and calendar months. Those inscriptions were a major clue. They told scholars this was not a toy. It was a tool for predicting events people cared about. Reconstruction work changed everything. Scientists used X-ray scans and three-dimensional models to map hidden gears. They rebuilt gear trains that fit the fragments. When a working model turned, the dials matched ancient cycles exactly. The Metonic cycle appears on a dial. The Saros cycle appears on a backplate. The machine predicted eclipses with the same rhythm ancient astrologers used. Here is the payoff. These are not crude gears. They are cut with surprising precision. The teeth sizes follow mathematical ratios. The mechanism simulates how the moon speeds up and slows down. To do that in bronze requires more than craft. It requires planning and accurate measurement. That changes how we see ancient workshops. Scholars debate the origin. Some point to Rhodes as the likely workshop. Others argue for Alexandria and its famous library. We have no signed name. We have fragmentary writing and high craftsmanship. That silence fuels speculation. Did entire workshops vanish when centers of learning collapsed? The evidence says yes. The loss of books and the shifting of trade routes erased skills that had narrow transmission. Now consider the social reason for disappearance. Practical devices get lost when their makers die and their patrons move on. Wars and changes in language bury instructions. A technique that depends on rare tools dies if those tools disappear. The Antikythera pieces sat undersea for centuries. Even after recovery, their meaning hid behind corrosion and broken labels. That slow erasure looks like suppression, but is often plain neglect. So, what are we left with? A bronze machine that proves ancient engineers achieved more than we thought. A handful of inscriptions that hint at knowledge we have only partly recovered. And a larger question about how many other complex tools went the same way. Baghdad Battery. You hold a cracked clay jar and your thumb finds a sealed lip. Inside is a copper tube. Inside that, a corroded iron rod. It looks like an old container until you remember how it was found and why people called it a battery. Archaeologists dug the pieces up near an old village outside Baghdad in the 1930s. The objects date to the Parthian or Sassanid eras. Some people saw the metal parts and had the same thought. Could this jar make electricity? The shape is right, the materials are right. Fill the vessel with vinegar or lemon juice, and the copper and iron start to produce a small current. It is not magic, it is basic chemistry. That simple experiment is the payoff that makes this object so tempting. A little voltage, a little chemistry, and a whole history looks different. If ancient hands knew how to make galvanic cells, then the roots of electrical technology go back thousands of years. That is the impossible idea that fuels late-night forums and bold headlines. But the full picture is messier. Experts point out there is no written account of using electricity from those periods. No lamps or electroplated objects from the region appear in the archaeological record. Alternative uses fit the artifact too. The copper tube could have held a rolled text. The jar could have been a storage vessel. The sealing bitumen may mean it kept something safe, not powered something. So why do some feel the story was erased? Partly, it is simple neglect. Objects without clear context become curiosities, not proof. Partly, it is sensationalism. A few experiments are not a full technology. And partly, the silence of ancient texts leaves a gap where speculation grows. Now ask yourself this: did people accidentally tinker with electrochemistry in isolated workshops that never spread their methods? Or is this a modern projection onto an everyday container? You test the jar again with vinegar and electrodes, and you get a faint buzz on a meter. That tiny hum is the evidence people latch onto. It shows the chemistry works. It does not by itself show a culture of electricians. Experts offer three main perspectives. One says this was an accidental electricity cell. Craftspeople working with copper and iron may have discovered that acids generate a current. They used that knowledge in small ways, and then it went nowhere. Another perspective says the jar was practical but not electrical. It could have been a container for scrolls or a ritual object sealed to protect something precious. The third perspective looks for special uses. Some researchers suggest electroplating as a possible application. A thin layer of precious metal on jewelry requires only small currents and basic chemistry. That idea is intriguing, but far from proven. Evidence matters here. The jar alone cannot tell us intent. There are no contemporary texts describing electric devices. There are no archaeological finds that clearly show electroplating from that era in that region. The safe academic stance is cautious. The exciting popular stance prefers a secret history. Both positions make the story interesting. So why do some people claim erasure or cover-up? Part of the answer is human nature. If an object hints at rewriting a story, people imagine conspiracies. Another part is plain history. Records burn. Workshops close. Skills can disappear when masters die and apprentices move on. A small technology that needs specific ingredients or tools can vanish quickly. Museums and early excavators sometimes mislabel objects. That slow drift of neglect can feel like deliberate erasure when talked about later. There is also a lesson about how we read the past. A single experiment can spark 1,000 theories. The responsible move is to expand the search to find supporting artifacts or texts. Until that happens, the jar sits between possibilities. It is a tidy device that opens a big door and then leaves it half ajar. If one little jar can change how we count the origins of electricity, then what do old maps and faded parchments hide about where people once sailed and what they once knew? Piri Reis map. You unroll a faded skin of parchment, and there it is, a coastline drawn with careful strokes and names in an old hand. The map is dated 1513, and it carries a note from its maker about the sources he used. For a moment, the world seems older and stranger than you learned in school. Piri Reis was an Ottoman admiral and cartographer who claimed to compile his chart from many earlier maps. He wrote that he consulted charts from explorers and even older maps that no longer exist. That claim is the spark. On one edge of the map, a southern landmass appears. Some readers see a coastline that looks like Antarctica without ice. That sight fuels the impossible idea. It asks how people of the early 16th century could draw a frozen continent centuries before its recorded discovery. Here is what is really happening. The map is a composite. ERASED wrote that he used about 20 sources. Those sources included Portuguese charts, reports from the Age of Discovery, and, possibly, fragmentary classical maps. The southern land may be a distorted rendering of the tip of South America or a speculative Terra Australis that map makers often drew when data was thin. Cartography in that era mixed observation with best guesses. Errors traveled and multiplied when map makers copied older works. Scholars criticize the Antarctic reading for good reasons. Geologists point out that Antarctica has been ice-covered for millions of years. Cartographers note scale and orientation problems on the fragment. Modern analysis shows matching features with early Portuguese charts of South America. Yet the map keeps its mystery because ERASED mentions lost sources. That statement invites speculation about ancient charts now vanished. So, what do we do with a map that hints at vanished knowledge? Do we see evidence of prehistoric exploration passed down in secret charts? Or do we see the normal mess of early modern cartography, where guesswork fills gaps and myth fills empty spaces? The map forces a hard choice between wild possibility and mundane error. Which is more unsettling, the idea of a lost global survey, or the knowledge that maps themselves can hide the history of what people once believed and what they later forgot? The fragment sat for centuries in a palace archive, and only drew attention when scholars finally studied ERASED's note about sources. His list is the handful of tinder that lit a fire. He wrote that his map used older charts, including some from Columbus. That admission lets speculation grow. If he really copied from older maps, then someone at some earlier time had coastal knowledge that later generations forgot. Charles Hapgood made the most dramatic claim. He argued that the southern outline matches Antarctic coasts before ice cover, and that ancient mariners passed along extremely old charts. His idea is cinematic, and it turned a museum fragment into a mystery that sounds like a thriller. Mainstream scholars pushed back hard, and with good reasons. Geologists explain that Antarctica has been ice-covered for millions of years. That alone makes a pre-ice shoreline impossible. Cartographers show how distortions in scale and projection can make South America ES tip look strange. ERASED worked from many sources. Copying errors stack. Sea charts of the early modern era often filled unknown areas with imagined land. That was standard practice, not secret science. Why then do people still speak of erasure and cover-up? Part of it is human. Missing files and lost maps invite stories. Part of it is historical. Power shapes knowledge. Naval and merchant charts were strategic assets. States and captains guarded routes. That secrecy can leave gaps in the record that later look suspicious. Libraries burn, empires fall. A single map, stitched from lost pieces, becomes a ghost of what once existed. So where does that leave us? With a fragile parchment that looks like proof and like a mistake at the same time? We are left with evidence that rewards both humility and curiosity. The map tells us how people stitched knowledge from many hands and how easy it is for that fabric to unravel. Drop a stones. You climb a narrow mountain pass and find a shallow cave. The light is thin, and the air smells of dust and old rock. In the dim, you see discs stacked like coins, each carved with a spiral groove and fine markings like a script cut by patient fingers. The story that follows reads like an adventure. Visitors to the Bayan Har region in the mid-20th century reported villagers who kept stone discs removed from a collapsed cave. An archaeologist or two, depending on the telling, photographed the stones. A researcher later claimed to decode the markings and to read a record of a crashed craft and survivors who landed long ago. That interpretation turned the discs into proof of contact from elsewhere. It also turned them into a secret that some say was suppressed. Here is the evidence and the problems with it. The primary sources are thin. There is no clear excavation report in a peer-reviewed journal. The photos that circulate online are low quality and sometimes contradictory. Museums that should hold such a find have no verifiable entries. The names of translators and universities shift between retellings. That pattern looks less like lost history and more like a story that grew around a few images and a claim. Skeptics point out how easily myths assemble. Local stone artifacts do exist across Asia, but they usually fit known cultural patterns. Extraordinary claims need solid context. Without clear provenance and scientific study, the discs remain intriguing curiosities, not proof. At the same time, the story matters because it shows how quickly absence of records can become a void that gets filled with wonder or conspiracy. So, what should you believe when an abandoned cave yields a few carved stones and wild translations follow? Do you trust the whispers and the missing files? Or do you wait for measured excavation and laboratory reports? You trace the spiral with your fingertip, and the groove under your nail is gritty from rock dust. The discs are small and cool. They look ancient in the way stone looks ancient, but the story around them moves faster than the weathering. According to the most dramatic accounts, the stones came from a collapsed cave in the Bayan Har Mountains in the 1930s. Villagers showed a foreign researcher a set of discs with spiral grooves. Years later, a scholar claimed to read the markings as a record. He said the text told of a craft that came from above and of survivors stranded among the hills. That claim turned the stones into proof of contact beyond the ordinary. That is the sensational angle, and it spreads easily. Photos circulate with handwritten captions. A few articles repeat the translation, and the tale grows like a rumor. The human mind likes a story that places us at the center of a cosmic event. That is why this find became popular, but good evidence needs more than a rumor. Serious archaeologists ask for excavation reports for context. They want stratigraphy dates and lab analysis of the stone and the patina. They want the discs in museums, with catalog numbers not only as images on web pages. In the Drop-A case, those elements are missing or confused. Names change in retellings. Photographs are low resolution and sometimes mismatched. Museums that should hold such artifacts have no verified entries. That pattern is what scientists call weak provenance. There are plausible explanations that are ordinary and boring. Local stone objects can be modern carvings made to sell. Misinterpretations can come from mixing local folklore with outsider theories. Political conditions can make fieldwork hard and records sparse. Governments may restrict access for reasons of national pride or security. That creates gaps. Gaps invite speculation. Speculation becomes a story that replaces missing data. So are the discs a lost message from visitors who once came from the sky? Or are they a cautionary example of how little evidence and a vivid tale can create a legend? The honest answer is, we need proper excavation and analysis. Until then, the stones sit on the boundary between possibility and fabrication. Voynich manuscript. You lift a heavy book, and the vellum crackles under your fingers, the ink still dark, and the pictures strangely alive, and the writing looks like nothing you have ever read. The manuscript dates to the early 15th century by tests on the vellum, yet the words do not match any known script. The book runs to about 240 pages, although some sheets are missing. It opens with strange plants that do not match gardens we know. Then come star charts with odd constellations, and pages of naked figures bathing in green pools. There are bottles and jars that look like a medieval pharmacy. The drawings give the book a kind of purpose, even if the text refuses to cooperate. Scholars have treated the book like a puzzle box. One group believes it encodes a natural language in a lost script. Statistical studies show patterns that resemble real languages and that keeps hope alive. Some cryptographers across the 20th century tried ciphers and came up with nothing decisive. In 2011, radiocarbon dating confirmed the vellum is truly medieval, which ruled out a modern hoax for the material. That finding made the puzzle honest and harder at the same time. Other experts remain cautious. Paleographers study handwriting shapes and ink flow. They see medieval workshop practices that suggest a learned but idiosyncratic author. Computational linguists run machine learning and find hints that the text obeys linguistic rules, yet the results are far from a readable sentence. A few voices say it could be an elaborate cipher, or even an invented text created to look authentic. Each perspective adds pressure and doubt. So, where does the mystery end and the responsible doubt begin? Do we keep throwing algorithms at patterns until meaning emerges? Or do we accept that some books were meant to resist translation? The manuscript sits between a secret and a silence, and it asks a deeper question about what we do when evidence refuses to speak. You flip to a page where plants spread their roots like strange maps, and you feel the manuscript resisting you. That resistance is the core of the problem, and the reason the book has obsessed people for a century. Scientists did the obvious things first. They tested the vellum and dated it to the early 15th century. They used multispectral imaging and found faint ink marks that were invisible to the eye. They digitized every page and put the images online. That turned a hidden book into the World S puzzle. Suddenly, thousands of people could study the same pages and compare notes. Professional cryptographers tried traditional ciphers and modern computers. Some argued the text encodes a known language, perhaps heavily abbreviated or encoded. Others applied machine learning and found statistical patterns that look like real languages. Those results excite people because they seem to point to meaning under the surface. Yet none of those claims produced a consensus reading that scholars accept. There are other possibilities. The manuscript could be written in a constructed language meant to hide information. It could be a complex shorthand for pharmaceutical recipes or astrological charts. Some think it is an elegant hoax created by a clever scribe to fool collectors. The evidence supports several of these ideas and rules out none. Part of why the book feels erased is simple. It has no known author and no contemporary references. That lack of context makes it easy for stories to grow around it. People imagine secret schools lost to war or private collections hidden by families. Those ideas are dramatic, but they are not evidence. So what should we conclude? The safest answer is that the Voynich manuscript is a real medieval object that resists our tools and our assumptions. It shows how silence can feel intentional when it is actually the result of time and chance. It also teaches a practical lesson. We should keep looking with careful methods and open minds. The book will not surrender its meaning to wishful thinking, but it may yield to persistent study. Nikola Tesla's Lost Inventions. You step into a room full of scattered papers and a cold coil standing like a silent tree. Dust draws a pattern on a blueprint, and you realize these were once plans meant to change how the world used power. Tesla built dazzling demonstrations in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. He patented ideas for wireless transmission of energy and for tuned resonance that could light lamps without wires. He began building a tower on Long Island in 1901. He called it Wardenclyffe. The tower was meant to send signals, and, in his vision, to send power across distances. He did not finish the project, and the tower came down in 1917. Later in his life, Tesla spoke of a teleforce, a weapon that newspapers named the death ray. He described a focused beam that could disable aircraft. He also talked about harvesting natural radiant energy and devices that sounded like free energy. After his death in 1943, many of his papers were taken into government custody. That fact feeds the mystery. Historians make three careful points. 1. His documented patents and experiments show real innovation, especially in alternating current and high-frequency circuits. 2. His larger claims lacked prototypes that survived, so they remain speculative. 3. The seizure of papers was routine wartime procedure and not proof of a global conspiracy. Believers take the opposite view. They point to missing notebooks and suggest governments suppressed technologies that would disrupt industries. Engineers note that some principles Tesla described do underpin modern wireless power research, but not at the scale he imagined. Physicists emphasize conservation laws and say free energy machines violate basic principles, so which is true? Did Tesla leave blueprints for world-changing devices that vanished into archive boxes? Or did he leave a trail of brilliant ideas that hit practical and economic limits, and then a few papers that simply disappeared into official custody? You stand before a locked filing cabinet and imagine a lifetime of notes stacked inside. That image is part of the Tesla legend. After he died in 1943, officials did collect many of his papers. Some files went to the Office of Alien Property Custodian. Some went to universities and museums. Over time, archivists cataloged and declassified many items. Others remain missing or were never found. Here is the fact-based view. Tesla left a large quantity of patent material and notebooks that are documented. Researchers have examined many of those archives. Wardenclyffe S. plans are in public records. Newspaper interviews where he describes bold ideas are preserved. The idea that everything revolutionary vanished overnight is not supported by the record. It is true that some personal notes disappeared. It is also true that wartime procedures sometimes moved private effects into government custody while ownership was sorted. That is bureaucratic and chaotic, but not automatically conspiratorial. Now, the technical reality. Tesla's work on resonance and high-frequency currents was real and influential. Some of his concepts map to modern wireless power experiments, like inductive and resonant coupling. Those technologies work at small scale and over limited distances. The grander claim of worldwide wireless power without loss faces hard physics and engineering barriers. The so-called death ray remained a concept he described, but never left with reproducible laboratory demonstrations that independent teams could validate. Why then do myths flourish? Human stories fill empty spaces. A missing notebook becomes a treasure chest in the imagination. Corporations and states with economic interests provide an easy villain for narratives that demand secrets. And Tesla himself cultivated a dramatic persona that invites heroic or tragic readings. So what would genuine suppression look like? Would a single recovered notebook suddenly change energy systems and global politics? Or would it more likely contain sketches that inspire incremental research rather than instant miracles? The smarter hope is for incremental insight. The dramatic hope is for world-changing blueprints. Sakara bird. You hold a small carved bird, and the wood is warm from old hands. The piece is roughly the size of your palm, and its wings spread in a simple, clean line. It was found in a tomb at Saqqara in Egypt and dated to around 200 BCE. Archaeologists catalogued it as a funerary object placed with a priest for the afterlife. The wood is sycamore, and the carving matches other toys and ritual models from the same burial. That context is the first anchor. Objects in tombs often had symbolic or practical roles for the deceased. In that light, the bird reads as a symbol of the soul, or a little toy meant to comfort. Then the curiosity began. The bird's silhouette, looks aerodynamic. Replicas were made, and some researchers threw them in wind tunnels. A few replicas will glide short distances when thrown at the right angle. That experiment is the payoff that feeds modern imaginations. A tiny wooden model can behave like a glider long enough to make you pause. Experts weigh in with caution. Aeronautical engineers note the replica lacks control surfaces and an airfoil shape needed for stable flight. The tail is rudimentary, and the wings are essentially flat. That means any gliding is short and unguided. Egyptologists add that there are no texts or depictions showing ancient Egyptians building aircraft. The symbolic meaning of birds in Egyptian religion is strong and well documented. So what are the perspectives? One says the model was a toy or ritual object with accidental gliding capability. Another says the shape hints at empirical observation of birds with no evidence of applied aeronautical design. A few fringe voices insist it records forgotten flight knowledge. The difference comes down to context and supporting evidence. What should you take away? A simple carved bird can be both an artistic symbol and a physical experiment in shape. It teaches that a single object can invite multiple readings. Does its ability to glide briefly mean ancient engineers existed? Or does it mean we are good at finding wonder where we want it most? London Hammer. You stoop by a shallow creek, and the rock looks different. Embedded in a hard lump sits a metal head and a stub of wood. At first glance, it reads like a tool stuck in stone forever. The popular story makes it impossible. People claimed the lump came from rock, dated 100 million years old. That would place a modern hammer deep in a time when mammals were tiny and humans did not exist. The image of a hand tool in ancient stone feeds the idea that history is wrong. Here is the straight explanation. The lump around the hammer is a concretion, not bedrock. Concretions form when minerals precipitate around objects in sediment. They can harden over years or decades given the right chemistry. A metal object left in a creek becomes a nucleus that collects mineral layers and eventually looks like stone. That process can fool the eye. Metallurgists examined the hammer. The head is iron with traces of copper, and the handle style matches 19th century tools. The alloys and manufacturing marks fit foundry techniques from the late 1800s and early 1900s. That is evidence the hammer was made in modern times, and later became encased in mineral deposits. So why did the sensational claim stick? One reason is storytelling. A single dramatic image travels far and fast. Another reason is misunderstanding of geology and absence of careful documentation at the moment of discovery. When a claim arrives without excavation records or lab tests, people fill the gap with wonder. A final reason is the appeal of rewriting timelines. Many want to believe that established history misses something fundamental. The useful lesson is practical. Anomalies deserve attention, but also need measured study. Concretions teach patience. Tools teach context. A hammer in a lump is interesting, and it becomes a lesson in how evidence can be misread. Ulfbert swords. You pull a long blade from a peat bog, and the edge still catches the light. Carved into the steel near the hilt is a name, a mark repeated across many finds. That signature told people this was not an ordinary sword. The blades date from the 9th to the 11th centuries. They appear all over northern Europe in graves and hoards. What makes them impossible is what is inside the metal. Some of these blades are made from very pure crucible steel. That material has fewer impurities and a high carbon content. In practice, that meant a sharper, stronger edge than most swords of the era. For smiths of their time, this was like finding a modern alloy in a medieval workshop. Scientists studied the blades with non-destructive methods. They found patterns similar to crucible or Wootz steel that medieval India and the Middle East mastered. That suggests trade in high-quality ingots or finished blades. It also suggests networks of exchange that reach much further than a simple village smithy. There are three main perspectives on the mystery. One says these blades are imports or made from imported steel, and they prove global trade-fed elite weapon markets. Two argues that local craftsmen adopted advanced techniques earlier than scholars assumed, and that lost workshops once had skills we no longer see. 3 points to copycats. The Ulfbert name became a brand, and imitators tried to match the mark without matching the metallurgy. Some blades, carrying the mark, are poor quality forgeries. The social meaning is clear. Owning a high-quality blade was social currency. It marked status and mobility. That explains why the name spread and why some blades were faked. It also explains why the technique could vanish. If production depended on rare ingredients or guarded workshops, the loss of a trade route or political change could wipe out the method. So, what matters most? Is it the blade that proves lost technology, or the story that trade and craft can move quickly and disappear even faster? When a craft vanishes, do we call it erasure, or just the ordinary fall of fragile skills? Crystal skulls. You lift one, and the quartz is colder than stone and warmer than glass. Light passes through, and the carved features stare back. The craftsmanship is sharp, and the expression is eerie, in the way a human face carved perfectly always feels a little alive. The first dramatic tales came from late 19th century collectors, and from adventurous stories in the early 20th century. One skull became world famous after a claimed discovery in a Central American ruin. Another surfaced in European collections, with a paper trail that was thin at best. Those early appearances fed a growing legend that these were ancient ritual objects with powers and secrets. Then science arrived. Curators and conservators took microscopes and three-dimensional analysis. They found tool marks made by rotary wheels and abrasives that match modern lapidary techniques. Microscopic striations showed modern abrasives, not the hand-polishing typical of pre-Columbian workshops. Chemical analysis and documented provenance revealed many of the most famous pieces first appeared in the market in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The Smithsonian and the British Museum published detailed studies. They concluded that the most famous examples are modern creations likely made for collectors. Even so, the story did not die. A vocal community argued for mystical properties and for hidden originals. New Age narratives layered on the scientific findings and kept the objects alive in popular imagination. So what changed? The big shift came from rigorous lab work tied to cataloged acquisition records. When artifacts come without excavation notes or secure find spots, scientists must rely on materials and microscopic traces. In this case, those traces told a modern story. The myth persisted because people prefer enchanted answers when they feel the world is too ordinary. What do you do with objects that are both beautiful and misread? Do you keep believing in lost temples and hidden powers because the idea comforts or thrills you? You have seen strange objects, faded maps, unread books, and whispered inventions. Now step back and ask what these 10 items share. The pattern matters more than any single wonder. First, loss by accident. Books burn, libraries fall, and workshops close. The Antikythera pieces sat under the sea for centuries. Wardenclyffe was partly destroyed by debt and time. When written instructions vanish, skills that once seemed common can disappear with a single bad year. That is ordinary history, but it looks like erasure when we first hear about it. Second, mislabeling and poor provenance. Objects without excavation records become stories. The London hammer became sensational because people saw a hammer in a lump and called it ancient. Proper geological context would have prevented the leap. The Dropa story shows how weak provenance invites bold narratives. Third, secrecy and strategic withholding. Maps and naval charts were strategic assets. Piri Reis himself used guarded sources. Some states and companies have kept routes and patents private. That can create real gaps, especially in recent centuries, and can make missing items seem deliberate. Fourth, Modern myth-making. The human mind loves a tidy secret. Crystal skulls and Tesla's most dramatic claims became legends because they satisfy a desire for hidden knowledge. When evidence is thin, a good story spreads faster than careful analysis. So, what are the practical lessons? Look for context. Ask where the object was found, who recorded it, and what lab tests support the claim. Favor multiple lines of evidence. Scientific methods like radiocarbon dating, microscopic analysis, and metallurgical testing matter because they move claims from rumor to fact. There is a final common thread. Some discoveries really do force us to rethink history, but most do not. The difference comes down to evidence and replication. If one find changes everything, the academic world will test it again and again. That is how extraordinary claims become accepted facts. Which of these possibilities scares you most? The idea that history hid powerful knowledge by accident, that it was intentionally suppressed, or that we are simply very good at making stories out of fragments. At this point, you can do more than admire mysteries. You can learn to read them. Start with context. Ask where the object or document came from and who recorded the find. Provenance is the single most important clue. If an item appears without excavation, notes, or acquisition records, treat extraordinary claims cautiously. Second-check methods. Look for laboratory work. Radiocarbon dating, microscopic scans, metallurgical analysis, and multispectral imaging are the difference between rumor and evidence. When experts publish methods and data, you can see how solid a claim is. When methods are missing, the story is thin. Third, demand replication. A single experiment or a single interpretation is a beginning, not an end. If others can reproduce the chemistry of a Baghdad jar, or if multiple labs read the same inscription that strengthens a claim, if only one voice makes a dramatic claim, be skeptical and ask for independent study. Fourth, weigh motive and context. Who benefits from a sensational interpretation? Secret histories draw attention and money. Museums and journals reward careful work. That is not a conspiracy. It is how knowledge advances. Consider both. Fifth, reserve room for surprise. History has real blind spots. The Antikythera mechanism and the Ulfbert blades changed scholarly views because evidence and study forced revision. Being cautious is not closing your mind. It is simply the smart way to let real revolutions emerge. Finally, act with curiosity and humility. Share surprising facts with questions, not proclamations. Ask which museum holds the object, which labs tested it, and where the peer-reviewed studies appear. If you want to keep the conversation alive, name the claim. You find most convincing and explain which evidence you would need to be sure. Which of the 10 stories would you like examined again with deeper sources and expert interviews? You stand before a sealed archive door, and the key is not where it should be. The sensation is ordinary. It is also the moment history changes. Missing keys, missing shelves, and missing pages make room for mystery. There are 3 big ways knowledge disappears. The first is accident. Libraries burn, ships sink, workshops close when a master dies. The Antikythera fragments spent centuries undersea. That is accident. It is common, and it is boring until a single recovery rewrites a story. The second is neglect and mismanagement. Objects without records move into private hands or into basements. Early collectors sometimes sold finds with little paperwork. The London hammer story grew because proper geological context was never recorded at discovery. When documentation is weak, a good narrative can replace careful study. The third is strategic withholding. Naval charts and patents can be kept secret for profit or security. States sometimes classify documents. Corporations sometimes buy or bury patents. Tesla's papers were handled under wartime rules, and that bureaucratic shuffling fed later rumors. Secrecy is not always sinister, but it can create real gaps. Each path produces different consequences. Accident means hope that more finds will surface with careful excavation. Neglect means we can improve storage cataloging and open collections to study. Strategic withholding means public pressure and legal channels can sometimes force release. There is also a human dimension. Stories fill gaps. People want wonder. That explains crystal skulls and Dropa tales. That urge is not wrong. It is part of how we make meaning. The challenge is to balance wonder with verification. So what can a viewer do? Ask for provenance. Look for lab methods and independent replication. Favor sources that publish data, not speculation. Share surprises with questions, not headlines. If you could open one archive in the world which locked collection would you choose, and what would you hope to find? You close the archive door, and the air smells of paper and time. That smell is a reminder. What we lose is often quiet and slow. We can act to change that. First, protect context. Archivists and museums must document where objects come from, who found them, and how they were recorded. Provenance is not bureaucratic red tape. It is the difference between a clue and a caricature. When finds are logged with maps and photographs, researchers can test claims and avoid wild leaps. Second, support open science. Publish methods and data. When researchers share radiocarbon results, imaging files, and chemical reports, a claim becomes testable. Open data invites independent checks and speeds discovery. It also reduces the space where speculation grows unchecked. Third, fund preservation. Stone, wood, and paper all decay. Simple investments in climate control storage and digital scanning save knowledge that would otherwise vanish. A modest grant can mean 1,000 years of survival rather than a single rainy season. Fourth, encourage public stewardship. Local communities often hold memory. Encourage training programs that teach record-keeping and respectful excavation. When villagers know how to document a find, they become partners, not obstacles. Fifth, challenge secrecy where it harms scholarship. Some strategic information must be guarded for safety. Other files belong in the light. Ask institutions to justify closures and to set review timelines. Transparency is not naive. It is how trust grows. Finally, balance wonder with method. Keep being excited by impossibilities. That excitement powers research and funds dig teams. Yet, pair enthusiasm with questions that demand evidence. Say, I want to know, not, I know it is true. That small shift makes public debate smarter. If you believe a claim, share it with sources, not slogans. Ask where the item is, who tested it, and how readers can see the data.